This week we're going to begin our exploration of language structures and linguistic analysis. So we're going to start with phonetics. And phonetics is really the process of the production of human speech and the organizations of the sounds that are possible in human speech. And we use the International Phonetic Alphabet to do this. So this week you're going to watch the explanation video, review the PowerPoint, read in our course text. Note, you only have to read up to file 2.5. You don't have to read the whole chapter. Watch this video on articulation disorders, complete your rough draft, complete your final draft, and comment on the presentations of at least 3 classmates. The practice problems this week through the next few weeks when we're doing linguistic analysis are probably going to take you a little bit more time than they have in the past. So make sure to budget your time accordingly. So let's talk a bit about phonetics. The International Phonetic Alphabet is a sound-to-symbol correspondence. So when we have different written languages throughout the world, we can represent different sounds differently. So one symbol in one language might represent a sound, and then another symbol in that same language could represent the same sound. So if you think of C and K in English, they both make the K sound at times. In the International Phonetic Alphabet, this is much more detailed. So the K sound is always going to be represented by the velar plosive, the voiceless velar plosive. So each sound that is possible in human speech is represented on the IPA, on the vowel chart, and on the non-pulmonic consonants. Non-pulmonic means we don't use our lungs. So if you think of clicks in some languages, that is included here. Any speech is possible to be made through the vocal tract of a human is represented here. Not all languages include all sounds represented here. English doesn't use a click system. Different languages use different sounds, but the way to organize it so that no matter what language we're talking about, we're using the same sound representation, we use the IPA. It's used by linguists to represent sound accurately. So if we go here, because you can see the chart, but that's not so helpful if you're not as familiar with, so what exactly does that mean? So on this chart, it'll have each sound represented with the symbol. So as you're doing your work this week, I would go back to this. So if you're confused on maybe what a vowel sounds like or what the consonant sounds like, you can see it here. So if we look at how English is represented in IPA, it looks a little confusing and a little overwhelming at first, right? But what you notice is our orthographic form does not necessarily line up with the phonetic transcription. So t still lines up, but then our vowel, our t, is represented by this upside down V. It's going to be tricky at first to get out of the mindset of looking at English orthography to moving to phonetic transcription, but once you start to understand that the sounds are always represented the same way, even if we write them different in English orthography, you'll start to understand it a little bit better. So how do we produce these speech sounds? We have these human bodies and they make these certain noises. How does it happen? So if we look at our speech anatomy, we start with the lungs. The air comes up through the vocal folds, it goes through the vocal tract, and then through the articulators. So let's talk about each of those a little bit. So here's our vocal tract. We start with our lungs down here. It moves up through the vocal folds. It either goes up into the nasal cavity if it's a nasal sound and the velum is lowered, or if the velum is raised, it goes through the oral cavity. So our lungs and our diaphragm produce the air. They contract, the air enters the lungs, it relaxes, and the air is pushed out. This is breathing. This is the power source of your speech. Then it goes through your vocal folds. And this is, if you're looking down into your body, this is what your vocal folds would look like. So when the air goes through, if they're open and there's nothing that's going to touch the air going through, that's called voiceless. So if you make the p, 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 p sound, the P sound, and hold your throat, you won't feel any vibration. That's a voiceless sound. Your vocal folds are open and the air is just passing right through. Now if you make the B sound, b, 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 and you feel your throat, you're going to feel a vibration. That's called voiced. It means your vocal folds are closed, and so the air is hitting it and it's making it vibrate. Now if you whisper, your vocal folds are kind of closed. You won't feel as strong of a vibration, but you will feel a little something. So when we talk about consonant sounds in English, we're always going to note if it's voiceless, if your vocal folds are open, or if it's voiced, if your vocal folds are closed and they're vibrating. Vowels are always voiced. Any vowel you come across is always going to be a voiced sound. So consonant is the only time we talk about voiceless or voiced. So now that we have the power coming up through our lungs, it's gone through our vocal folds, now we have to talk about resonation. So if you're familiar with music, resonation is where the air hits. It's kind of the cavity that it hits. So we can manipulate the cavity of our vocal tract. So for instance, when we talked about the velum a second ago, we can lower it or we can raise it, and that'll change which cavity is open. So if it's lowered, the air is going to come up here through our nasal cavity, and that'll give us one type of sound. If it's raised, the air is going to come through our oral cavity, and that's going to give us a different type of sound. We can also change the cavity through moving our jaw and moving our tongue. So that's all changing this cavity that the air is going to flow through. This is going to be really important in vowel production because our tongue really almost dictates what the vowel sound is. And then articulation. So we've talked about the cavity. Our air is coming up through our lungs, it's going through our vocal folds, and now we've created a cavity either in our nasal or in our oral. So we've created this open setting for the sound to go through, the air to go through to make a sound. But then we can further break up that sound. So it's coming up, it's going through the oral or nasal cavity, and then we can move things to manipulate that sound. This is called articulation. So our moving components include the tongue, the lips, the soft palate, and the jaw. So we can move all of those to manipulate and articulate the sound. The fixed items are our teeth, our hard palate, and our alveolar ridge. Your alveolar ridge, if you go right behind your front teeth, you'll feel kind of a bump at your alveolar ridge. So these are our points of articulation. This is where we break up the speech sound. This whole process, when we move different components, the sum of that different change, the vocal folds, the resonation, the cavity, or the articulation, give us individual speech sounds. So again, our air moves out of our lungs, our vocal cords vibrate or they don't. We create resonation in either the oral or the nasal cavity, and then we shape or we stop the air using our articulators. And through that whole process, each individual aspect, we can make different speech sounds. So that's how we describe our English consonant sounds. So we talk about whether it's voiced or voiceless, where the place of articulation is. So are we using our teeth? Are we using our alveolar ridge, etc.? And then the manner of articulation. Are we giving it a full push out of our lungs? Are we giving it a burst? So if we look at the example for p, 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 our vocal folds are not vibrating. It's voiceless. Our lips come together. So our place of articulation is bilabial. We're using both of our lips. And then the air is released in a burst. So that's our manner of articulation. We call that a stop. Now, if you want to play around with this, you can use this interactive vocal track here, and it'll let you see kind of how we manipulate sounds. So is it going through the nasal cavity? Are we moving our tongue? Are we putting our lips together? So on and so forth. So our vowel sounds, we know they're always going to be voiced. Our vocal folds are always closed when it comes to vowel sounds. So how we describe our vowel sounds is we talk about our tongue height, our tongue advancement. So is it in the front of our mouth? Is it in the back of our mouth? Our tense, and then our rounding. So are our lips rounded? Are they unrounded? So here's a vowel chart that'll let you play with the different sounds, the vowels. So you can hear them a little bit better when you're having to diagram different sounds. I promise you, when you start to diagram, things will start to sound so similar that you'll need a fresh voice when you're producing it. You'll need to see and hear somebody else produce it so you can hear yourself again. Now, we can also describe speech sounds using suprasegmental features. So our discrete sounds are all those sounds on the IPA chart, but a lot of sounds go even further into specification. So the length that we use them, the intonation, our tone, our stress when we're producing them. And you can account for all of these in IPA writing. It's very detailed. It's a very detailed process. We're not going to focus on that in this course. You would need a whole class just in phonetics to get a really deep understanding of these aspects. And we really want to focus on the discrete sounds, developing a really strong understanding of how our students produce these sounds and different things that can impact their production as they're acquiring a language. So what I want you to do is practice these couple problems on your own. The first one is going to, oh, I didn't change the page numbers. These should all be page 99. I'll edit that in the PowerPoint. The first one is going to talk about voiced and voiceless problems. Then it's going to have you reading IPA problems, and then it's going to have you try and write them out yourself. So the answers are provided here. Try them on your own. It's going to help you with your rough draft of your practice problems. Let me know if you have any questions as you get started. It's a dense week as we're getting into these linguistic structures, and I promise you this phonetics week is going to be the most difficult because it's your first time really exploring these structures. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling stressed, that's okay. That's normal. I'm here to help you as you're going through. You can work in a study group as you're doing your rough drafts. We're going to look at the final drafts and we're going to see the answers and see your corrections. So I promise you this is going to be the toughest week because it's your first week really getting into it. But if you stick with it, as you go, you'll start to really get your bearings. Let me know if you have any questions.